Learn to love change? Is that even possible? As the rate of change continues to accelerate in the world, most of us would benefit from feeling a little bit more affection for it. So in today's webinar, we're going to explore the key principles that drive successful change and share how it's helped one of our many clients. So let's get started. First up, some introductions. My name is Julian Andrews, and I'm your MC. A tip of the hat also to Kieran Budia, who is twiddling the dials in the background. And a huge round of applause for today's presenter, Paul Stewart, CEO of TakeON.
Thanks very much, Julian, and certainly it's an evocative title, Learning to Love Change, particularly given the fact that most people don't like change, let alone love it. For example, behavioural studies suggest that only around 20% of people really embrace change naturally. They're the stars that you can see at the top of this diagram. And then there's those at the bottom of the diagram who vehemently dislike it, those strongly opposed to change. But actually the bulk of people fall in the middle. They're the group I like to call the bystanders. They're cautious, unsure and ambivalent. They're certainly not loving change though. So today what we're going to do is look at three things. Some research around successful change. Secondly, some perspectives that have come from our TakeON community of clients and partners. And thirdly, our approach to developing leaders to be more effective with change. I'm going to start just by positioning a case study and introduce this very briefly and then come back to it later in the webinar. This is a case study about a financial services organisation which underwent an acquisition and a merger, introduction of new processes and policies, and complicated by some really challenging external factors. The Christchurch earthquake in New Zealand, which was in 2011, and the legacy of that and the impact of that continues to impact upon organisation and its customers. There's also been significant amount of regulatory change during this period of time, and that all adds up to a very complex and highly emotional environment. So in this case study, the managers were quite seasoned. They were quite experienced. People from the contact centre, the branches, the area managers, they'd all had quite a lot of leadership development previously, but this type of change was very, very new. Having gone through a program, a TakeON program that helped them work through the change over the period that was really directly impacting them, this was sort of the headline result, 100% of people feeling more confident about dealing with the change, which is a pretty impressive result. The organisation stakeholders and sponsors were obviously very happy about that. And more about the results later. But this one really gets to the core of it. The confidence level in dealing with change was high because, in fact, they were building capability in the context of the change that was at hand. And let's be clear, context from our point of view is key. Capability development in this instance occurred within and at the time the change was happening, not before or not after. Sounds simple, but it's actually a critical point. We believe the two, development and change, must go hand in hand. Speaking of context, let's put some context around change in general. And I guess it's fair to say that in today's world, change is pretty much a constant. And in fact, it's getting faster and faster and faster. This diagram is from a presentation I came across a few years ago called World After Midnight, put together by a guy called Eddie Obeng in the UK. It basically says that the rate of change in the world has now exceeded our capacity to absorb it all, at least based on the more traditional approaches used within organisations. Maybe that feeling resonates with a lot of us. The rate of change in the external world is so rapid, it's hard to keep up.
Okay, so that seems like a good time to get your perspective. So let's do a poll. We want you to vote. So as I said before, let your fingers do the walking. What we'd like you to tell us is how far out do you feel safe predicting where your business will be? So is it 1 month? Is it 3 months? Is it 6 months? Or is it 12 months? So vote now. Remember, select one answer. We'll give you a few seconds to do this. Right, okay, we're going to be closing now in 3, 2, 1. Kieran, what are the results? Here we go. This is fairly interesting. It's fairly evenly tied at between 3 and 6 months. Paul, what's your feedback?
Yeah, I guess that's pretty much on the mark, Julian. 6 months out is not a long time. Some people feel that they're pretty confident about 12 months. I certainly feel as a CEO of this company, it is increasingly difficult to actually determine exactly what is going to happen in the future. Things are changing very, very quickly, which means we need to be responsive and agile to that. And in fact, here's an interesting quote from one CEO, the CEO of Chorus, a telecommunications company here in New Zealand. And he said, "In my 30-year plus career, I've never known what was going to be happening in 6 weeks' time. If you can't handle that level of uncertainty, then you shouldn't be in the telecommunications industry." So in summary, it's really hard to know what's coming down track. But what we do know is that we're going to have to face increasing amounts of change. Here's a great quote from the late Michael Hammer, who was one of the gurus in business process re-engineering. He said, "The secret of success is not actually predicting the future, it's becoming a person who can thrive in a future that cannot be predicted." Lovely take on this perspective of change and leadership. So all of this probably leads us to believe that we as organisations and as leaders have gotten quite good at dealing with change by now, wouldn't you think? Well, actually, let's cast our minds back 20 years or so ago, and John Cotter, considered by many to be the grandfather of change management, he wrote the seminal text Leading Change in 1996 and made the point that over 2/3 of improvement and change programs fail to deliver significant results. Surely 20 years later and things have changed. Well, look forward to 2008 and the failure rate remains very much at the same level. This is another study by McKinsey and Company in 2008, and they argued that the failure rate was still at around 70%, so no improvement. And yet so much has been written on managing change. In putting together this webinar, we went to Amazon and we found out that there are more than 23,000 book titles that come up under the topic of managing change. Do a Google and reference, and the references to change are actually in the millions. So don't misunderstand me. A great deal of the stuff that has been written about change is good. But for some reason, we are still getting the application of this quite wrong. And maybe we can take a key or an insight from this person here, Ron Ashkenar, who writes regularly in HBR. And this blog post in 2018, I was really quite taken by it. He said, "The contents of change management is reasonably correct, but the managerial capacity to implement it has been woefully underdeveloped." And he goes on to say that instead of strengthening managers' ability to manage change, we've allowed managers to outsource change management to areas like HR and other specialists and consultants on the outside, instead of taking accountability for themselves. And that's an approach that doesn't work. Because at the end of the day, what we need to appreciate, and I'm sure we understand, change is a constant. And therefore it needs to be business as usual, rather than being a distraction from business as usual. Management must own change, and they must be equipped to lead it. I've said it before, and I'll say it again, the problem with this is not in the thinking, it is in the doing it. Who's doing it, and how are they doing it? So for the next section, we're going to look at this from 3 different angles. The first is, how is change typically approached? The second is, when we look at successful change, how is that actually being done? And what can we learn about loving change to do change? So, typical change. What does a typical approach to a major change in an organisation look like? And feel free to raise your hands, your virtual hands on the webinar if some of these things resonate with you. Typically, the first thing we do if there's a major change is we set up a project team. And the idea is we want to keep it separate from day-to-day business. Perhaps people volunteer to be part of the project, or perhaps they are conscripted to be on the project and pulled out of their day-to-day job to attend the project and participate in it. But really, the emphasis here is trying not to distract the main part of the business from the change agenda as it has been formulated and designed, let alone impacted. The second thing is that the focus of these teams and the focus of the process around change is often around what's wrong or what could go wrong. You start to see dashboards like this one, where attention is entirely drawn to the red lights, the things that are falling behind, where we're off schedule, the things that aren't going well. And then, of course, there's the dreaded issues register for a change project. Interesting question to ask. Have you ever seen a register of successes? I don't think I see that very often. Thirdly, we tend to defer time and resources away from developing people. So while we're putting resources into the project, they're not invested into developing the capability of the people impacted by the project. Everyone is stressed about the lack of capability, but when it's discussed, it's always, yes, yes, we'll get around to that after the change is dealt with, because we really need to focus what's on the change agenda right now. So to summarise that, here's a typical way of doing change. This is the mainstream as it appears. Keep it separate from day to day, put a strong focus on what's going wrong, and defer the development of people. What say we look at successful change? Because while round about 70%, according to McKinsey, of major change projects fail, that still leaves a percentage of those that are successful. And in 2010, they undertook a major study across the world of major transformations in organisations. 2,500 executives representing different functions, companies, sectors and countries around the globe. These were leaders who had been deeply involved in major transformations. And remember, while most of them weren't successful, there were some that were. And this is what McKinsey observed. They said that when organisational transformations succeed, managers typically pay attention to people issues, especially fostering collaboration among leaders and employees and building their capability. So successful change projects have three things in common. The first is they involve people in the change. Rather than separate the project from business as usual, success comes when everyone impacted by the change is involved from the outset and ongoing. It means that leaders ensure staff feel a sense of ownership and staff start to take initiative to help to drive the change. Secondly, in successful transformations, there is a much stronger orientation to focusing on and communicating the strengths and successes, more so than the problems and issues. So unlike typical doings where everything is about the risk and the problems, here airtime is given to what we are doing well. And I believe this has two benefits. The first is it brings confidence into the change agenda. And that's particularly important early on in any major change. People feeling a sense of momentum and progress and positivity around it. And the second thing it does is by analysing our successes and strengths, it brings great insights as to how to build the next steps for the future in terms of the progress around change. And the third strong factor was actually the importance of building leadership capability. Developing capability may not improve short-term performance in relation to the change, but the one thing that is very clear from the research, it improves the sustainability and the long-term impact of the change. And again, this has two other long-term benefits. Leaders and staff develop new skills which continue to be applied into the future, and actually the culture becomes more supportive of innovation, change and improvement in general. So summarising those three things, and of course there are no guarantees around success, but summing it up, if you engage everyone collaboratively throughout the change process, accentuate the positives more than the negatives, and build leadership capability as you go, then you hugely increase the probability of success. So what about loving change? Let's look at it from that dimension. And how do we create the optimal environment to bring about this type of reaction? Well, we asked our TakeON community via the internet, which is our online collaboration platform. It's made up of our customers and our partners from around the world. And we simply asked this question: when have you felt most excited about change? We got lots of great responses, and I'd just like to share 2 or 3 with you right now. Here's what one person said: it's interesting that in some people, just being involved on those changes has a big effect. They see the business as taking the change seriously, and that we're all open to improvement, and importantly, that they feel a part of it. So, summary point: we're loving change when people feel involved. For me, that means loving change comes from really engaging people on an ongoing basis. They make it feel like their ideas are being listened to, that they can, as individuals, influence and affect the direction of the change, particularly in the context of where they sit in the organisation, that there are no real hidden agendas or predefined solutions, that we all just want to make the most effective solution for the business, the one that will make our lives easier and make the business more successful as well. In our TakeON case study, this was particularly evident in one meeting, when one of the senior participants talked about how she had previously not been aware of how much pressure her colleagues in other departments were under, and how, having known that now, she could actually assist them, support them, and get involved in helping them along the way. Here's another insight from the TakeON community. This person said that engaged and positive change for me requires strong leadership and direction. I am more responsive to change when the people leading it are clear and have a positive and motivating demeanour. The deliverer or leader of the change can be as important as the change itself. So this is suggesting that we're loving change when leadership is positive and motivating. The emotions of our leaders, as we know, spread like wildfire through an emotional contagion through teams and across the organisation. So if leaders aren't upbeat, if they're not positive, it's really hard to remain the positivity and forward-looking aspects around the change itself. A third comment from the TakeON community: what gets me excited is seeing people that I've worked with and learn to fly, to start to believe in themselves and do things they never thought possible. I think this is my job as a leader, and it's the bit I love best. So again, paraphrasing that, we love change when we're seeing others grow. And personally, this really resonates. When we look back at the case studies and the clients that we've been involved in, clearly the biggest buzz for us is seeing other people succeed. So summarising those 3 points, we love change when people feel involved, when leadership is positive and motivating, and when we're seeing others grow. So, right, let's bring all of those 3 streams together. The typical approach to change, what we can learn from successful changes, and what we can learn from people's experiences in terms of when they personally have loved change. And an interesting pattern emerges. The first is that typical and successful change are largely the opposite of each other. Separate from business as usual, in typical, engaging everyone throughout. In successful, focusing on the risks and issues in typical, focusing on strengths and successes in the successes, deferring development in the typical, building capability as we go in the successful. But also, looking from the positive point of view, the correlation and relationship between successful change and loving change is fundamentally the same thing. So in creating an environment where people are embracing and loving change, it suggests that our chances of success in terms of driving good outcomes from the change skyrocket as well. So there's an underlying key theme coming through here that we want to look at in the final part of the webinar, and that is around building management capability. So what are the types of management capabilities that are important for change to be successful and, of course, to be loved? It raises a question. What sort of capabilities should we be looking to develop in our managers? Well, let's take a look back at that case study and as I mentioned, it was framed around a TakeON program, a series based around change for all of the leaders involved in that very complex situation in the financial services company. Obviously, it depends on what capabilities are most required for the change at hand. But here's a typical sort of approach that might support. You can see here in this diagram the management capability building dimension, which represents about 6 months of process. That is, leaders coming together in peer groups once every 6 weeks for around 3 hours and having very rich conversations and focusing on these competencies and the application back to the change that they are facing at that point in time. In this example, the sequencing went from dealing with ambiguity onto emotional resilience, into some of the more technical aspects of managing change, and finally, courageous conversations. And of course, those conversations, or these themes, these modules, if you like, were timed to coincide most directly with when they were relevant in terms of the change going on. Simple example, when's the best time to focus on building our understanding and capability for delivering courageous conversations? Right at the point in time you're going to have some courageous conversations. Maybe it's about talking to people about the uncertainty of jobs moving ahead, or the fact that there are going to be significant impacts upon them. The best time to develop that capability is right when you need to apply it. Because whatever perspective that we look at it from a research point of view, and this is just one example, the classic Lominger model, which suggests that when we look back and through our careers, successful people and successful leaders believe that while training and classroom activity was important, as was the influence of mentors and other influential leaders around them, most of the development actually happens through application on the job. And that's what the TakeON approach is really leveraging, is maximising the opportunity to leverage it or apply it in the context of the change that is happening at that point or at any point in time. Back to the case study. So, a couple of other results. We talked about the confidence one early on. This result, just after 2 months of completion of that 6-month series program, 85 participants say that they've really been able to transfer what they've learned back onto the job. So that's a pretty good result. 15% still struggling a little bit. They have to be dealt with and supported separately, but the bulk of people are well on track in terms of application into their jobs. And even more significantly, this question, 68% felt that the business results were better as a result of the development they've gone through. 28% saying it's simply too early to sell. Now here's the kicker. This is just in the short term, because you'll remember from the McKinsey research I talked about earlier, it suggests that the real benefits of the development in terms of business results will come in 6 to 9 to 12 months' time. So 68% feeling like business results are already improving is an outstanding result. Did they all learn to love change? Well, no. But a lot of them felt more confident and comfortable in the change environment. Let me reference a quote from just one of the participants who said that without doubt the last 12 months have been the most challenging of my career, but they've also been the most rewarding. So, conclusions. It's not a matter of being able to love change. In fact, we sort of need to love change because it's with us. It's not going away. It needs to be, if we're going to be an effective leader, something that we are constantly embracing and enjoying. Long-term success correlates directly to improved capability of leaders, and context is key. We need to develop the skills when they're needed, and as a result of that, everyone ends up happier.
All right, okay, thanks Paul for all of your insights, and thanks also to Kieran for doing such a great job producing, and thanks to you, our audience, for the time. So what happens next? Well, now's the time to ask questions. Brett's got in there with a couple of comments early, so if the rest of you want a chance to get your question in, then I'd start now. We'll stay online to give answers for the next 5 minutes. In the meantime, I understand that some of you may be pressed for time and will have to go. All I'd ask when you leave is that the survey will pop up automatically. We'd really love it if you could fill it out. It's only a couple of questions, and it would be really helpful for us to get some feedback and in terms of learning what you'd like to do next. Moving on from there, you'll each receive an email in the next few days with a link to a recording of the session. And on a really simple level, we'd love you to share this with your colleagues, your friends, and anyone else who you know that would benefit from this. Maybe your children, could be your wife, I don't know. The truth of it is, the email will also include a link to a free tool. This is where perhaps you could use it with your children. It's called Taking Charge of Change. I certainly know that my 8-year-old and 6-year-old could benefit from this. It helps leaders shape initial conversations around the transformation at hand. As I say, it's completely free, and what we're trying to do is actually just give you a bit of a taster, demonstrate our approach before you get to try some for yourself. And if that's what you're after, well, go to www.takeon.biz. Here, there's a demo, and I think this is really cool. I mean, basically what it is it allows you to build your own program. And it might be change, it might be innovation, who knows, it might be productivity that you're looking for. But you can kind of get a taste of the way in which we kind of customize our projects. You can also find a full list of the TakeOn partners who are able to work with you all over the world here at www.takeon.biz. Finally, please join our LinkedIn group. That'll keep you up to date with the latest developments, and it's probably the closest thing that we've got to being able to experience the internet if you're not actually a participant in the TakeOn program. So it's a good way to kind of get up on that. Okay, we've had some great questions come through, so let's start with Brett's comments. Brett, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you talked about them more as comments than anything else. Rather than ask people to manage change, maybe it's better to train people how to accept change. And then further on in the presentation, Brett added, change happens constantly, so learning to accept it and embrace it and looking at it as an opportunity to grow and evolve, etc., perhaps. I mean, I think that's very much in line with the kind of stuff that you were talking about already, isn't it, Paul?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's right, Julian. And the problem is that we still face this fundamental human dimension where we're just happier doing, most of us are just happier doing the same thing as we did yesterday and what we did before. So we're sort of pre-programmed to resist change in that sense. A lot of people are. So that's the sort of psychological thing we're having to overcome. Really interesting perspective that we developed when we did some work up in Malaysia, where we were working with a global bank there. And we actually did 2 major projects with them. One was actually transforming or changing the existing business. And the second project was actually launching a brand new bank, actually an Islamic finance bank, the first time that this global bank had done that anywhere in the world. The interesting thing with launching the new bank was that we didn't have anything to change. We were actually focusing on more around what we wanted to create. And so the psychological dynamic of that was fundamentally different. And much more positive, much more engaging. People much more up for it than the change transformation project that had gone before. And I guess the insight I took from that is simply if we can adopt a different mindset rather than focusing on what we need to change, but more about what we're wanting to create for the future, you can overcome a lot of that resistance.
I think, you know, I'm new to the whole area of leadership development, and for me, one of the things is that if you actually get people together and you actually say, when was change positive for you in your life? You get some really interesting responses. You know, the idea of moving house, it's such a hassle when you're faced with it, but in fact, once you're in the new house, invariably you feel so much better about it because it's got more space or whatever. So I think that keeping people, reminding them, I guess, of when change has a positive effect is really beneficial. All right, moving on to the next question. Yeah, here's a good one. James asks, do you need to relearn change skills for each new change?
Well, I think, Julian, each change scenario is different, either slightly different or fundamentally different. We become, over time, as we have to cope with more change in different contexts and different situations, obviously we get more experienced in navigating our way through that. But there's always something to learn. And, you know, one of the key things that comes out of a lot of research around successful leaders is that they have what's called a very high level of learning intelligence, and that means it doesn't matter how good they get, they're always striving to learn more and understand better. And I think that's certainly true in terms of change management. There are always ways that we can improve our ability, our knowledge and our capability in that environment.
And again, I think that's one of the huge strengths of the TakeON program, is that whole idea that we don't just come in like a consultant and tell you what to do. What we're actually going to tell is, what we're trying to do is teach you to fish. So that idea that very much that we'll give you the skills, and then one of the reasons that we've got the online platform, the internet there, is because when you need to go back, you can do it yourself. And that's the thing is that you go back, you reread the themes, and then you discuss it internally. So the whole point is that we're not saying that you have to come back to us to relearn skills every time there's a change. All we're saying is you need to go back and reflect with each other about those particular changes. Christian says, listen, I'm really excited about these programs. What's the best way to get started?
I guess, Christian, yeah, good question. It's about a change of mindset, really, and in terms of what you want to really do, what we believe is you want to be building this methodology, this approach into the normal cadence of the organisation, rather than setting it up as a program as such, which is off the side of business as usual. But often the best way to test that and trial that is to take one area of the organisation, a fairly self-contained area, that might be going through some significant change at that point in time, and sort of pilot and trial the approach there. It's a low risk approach. It's also a way to learn about how to make the program most relevant within the context of that organisation as well.
It's like you spoke about, Paul, I think, to begin with, where we've had some great successes, where we've managed to get people in a kind of small environment like that to start raving about it to their peers and colleagues in other departments. I can think of at least one of the American scenarios that we're talking about, where it seems now that the initial team is on board, then there's much wider interest. And what's the number around? They signed up for an initial term of just a couple of months, didn't they?
Well, 8 months.
Yeah.
They piloted the approach, and this actually, there was a slightly different dimension on this. This was focused around innovation, so it's looking at change through a slightly different lens, but building innovation and an innovation culture into the organisation. Initially, they signed up for an 8-month program, if you like, involving this division of the organisation. 4 months in, halfway through, they indicated that they wanted to extend for another year and a half or so, because they were already seeing the benefit driving through the organisation, and they could see the long-term possibilities that it offered.
I think this ties quite nicely into Christian's second question, actually. Thanks for this one as well, Christian. How do I sell my exec management on the value of the program?
I think, it's business results. Ultimately, when you're the key thing here is, and you come back to that tension that we often feel when we're talking with executives, which is this idea that we need to develop our people. And this reluctance to do so because there is so much change going on in the organisation. Really, what we're wanting to do here is provide a framework and a focus around the fact that building the capability as we go has some long-term benefits in terms of that capability build, but most importantly, it's going to maximise the results of the change and the possibility of the success of the organisation. And if we use that type of research that I provided from McKinsey and others, it's really it's quite a compelling picture in terms of really facing into what is the status quo and addressing those issues of failure, because most executives recognise that large-scale change in organisations is very complex, very difficult, and is generally not that successful. So let's take a look at it from a different lens.
I think the other thing about it is everybody seems to be looking for success stories. And what I love about the TakeON program is that basically it's designed specifically to create success stories. And it doesn't matter whether or not you're talking about your frontline leaders, all the way up. These structured conversations are all about focusing on what's going well. And in that context, suddenly, everybody has a great story to tell, including members of the executive management team.
Yeah, and I think the other thing about TakeON, if we're talking specifically about that, is it's quite unique in the sense that it's very modular and what we call configurable, and internally led. It's about leaders themselves driving the development, coming together, sharing experiences amongst peer groups, leveraging the knowledge that exists within the organisation. So it's not about sending people on, external programs that are distracting and costly. As I said, the idea is that you just build it into the rhythm and routine of the organisation. So there might be regular times that groups of leaders get together, maybe on a quarterly basis or monthly basis, and you can just build this in as part of that process. So for a period of time, they're focusing in on a capability or concept that is really relevant to them at that point in time.
This is probably a really good time for me to pop in just a little bit of a plug for next month's webinar. Next month's webinar is, of course, Learn More About TakeON, and that is very much about actually going into the structure of the program and how it works. We've probably got time for just one more question. James has given us an interesting one. Paul, do you need to relearn change skills for each new change?
I think the short answer to that is yes, because obviously the more experienced we are, the more knowledgeable we get over time. The better are we conditioned and able to cope with change. But the reality is every change is different. There's always a level of ambiguity and uncertainty and complexity, and you need to face into that. You need to acknowledge that it won't always just be smooth because you've done this type of thing a couple of times before. It's always going to be different. That's the nature of human behaviour and cultures within organisations. The interesting thing is there are a lot of studies that show that the most successful leaders have what is called a very high learning intelligence. And what that means is it doesn't matter how good they are at any point in time, they never lose the desire to look to see how they can improve and develop and continue to grow as a leader within the organisation.
And I think this is where the Internet really comes into its own, doesn't it, in the context of while they may have done a theme 6 months ago, if a change occurs and they need to go back and have another courageous conversation, for example, all of those resources are available just there on the Internet for them to tap into again. They don't have to bring in the external consultant to teach a whole new group of people the courageous conversations. It's that whole notion of transferring capability. Is that, yes, while they may have to relearn those skills, the truth of it is that they can do that just by reading up. All right, look, Paul, I'd like to say once again, thanks heaps. Thanks to all of you for listening. And as I say, we'll be back in a month's time for Learn More About TakeON. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much, everyone.